22 passenger planes lost power within the same terrifying hour, and every screen inside Skylance Aviation flashed red. CEO Vanessa Whitmore demanded one name, the engineer who had prevented a catastrophe. One by one, the company's best specialists turned toward the empty workstation of Ethan Mercer, the quiet single father she had fired that very morning for insubordination. But Ethan had left behind more than a warning. Hidden inside the fleet's emergency software was a safeguard only he understood. Now, with hundreds of lives depending on his return, Vanessa had to face the man she had publicly destroyed and the truth her own executives had buried. Stay until the final landing, because Ethan's greatest rescue was never the planes. It was the truth buried inside the company that fired him. The story began on the morning Skylance Aviation, prepared to announce a merger worth $4.6 billion, a deal that would define the company for the next generation and make its executives wealthy beyond anything they had imagined. 22 Aerolynx 90 aircraft were scheduled to fly commercial routes across the country that day, carrying thousands of passengers who had no idea their safety depended on a fight already happening quietly inside a building none of them would ever see. Ethan Mercer arrived before almost anyone else, as he always did, and reviewed the overnight flight data with the same careful patience he brought to everything. Buried inside the numbers were 3 brief instances where the power management system had lost synchronization for less than 2 seconds each, gaps too short for any pilot to notice, but long enough under the wrong conditions to trigger something far worse. Over the previous 6 weeks, Ethan had filed 12 separate reports describing the anomaly, and every single one had been quietly downgraded by Preston Hale, the company's vice president of engineering, a man who valued timelines more than warnings. Preston insisted the readings were nothing more than sensor drift, a nuisance rather than a danger, and he made it clear that further delays to the certification schedule would not be tolerated. Ethan's life, outside those walls, was simple and solitary. He had raised a daughter alone for years, and though she was grown now and living her own life in another state, the discipline of that responsibility had never left him. He had learned long ago how to carry pressure without complaint, and how to keep showing up, even when no one thanked him for it. Mara Keene, a senior systems engineer, who trusted Ethan more than she trusted almost anyone else at the company, warned him that Vanessa was preparing to announce the largest deal in the company's history, and that any report threatening to ground the fleet could cost him his job. Ethan told her that an airplane did not care whether a stock price was rising or falling. It only cared whether the people on the ground had the courage to tell the truth before it was too late. That same week, he discovered that a software update from an outside vendor was scheduled to install automatically across all 22 aircraft overnight, an update that could trigger the exact failure he had been warning about for weeks. He asked Preston to halt it immediately. Preston refused and threatened to remove Ethan from his position if he pushed the issue any further. That night, instead of going home, Ethan sat alone at his desk and opened a folder containing an emergency protocol he had built years earlier and never needed to use, one labeled simply as a failsafe, designed to isolate any cascading power failure before it could spread. He spent the entire night reinforcing it, knowing it could not fix the underlying flaw, but could, if triggered in time, detect the pattern of desynchronization, seal off the failing controller, and shift each aircraft onto its backup power source before catastrophe took hold. Rather than quietly altering flight software on his own authority, Ethan sent a 13th report, this time addressed not only to Preston, but to Vanessa, the legal department, and the safety board, directly stating plainly that all 22 aircraft could lose primary control under the same plaque. Weather conditions within days. Preston intercepted the report before it ever reached Vanessa's main inbox, quietly changing its risk classification from severe danger to minor deviation, then instructed the engineering team to proceed with the update as planned. Mara discovered the alteration but said nothing out of fear for her own position, and Ethan did not blame her for it. He simply asked her to keep an untouched copy of the original test data somewhere safe just in case. During a routine maintenance drill days later, Ethan activated his failsafe under the guise of restoring an older protective layer that had been approved years before and had only recently been disabled to save processing time, careful not to touch the primary flight control program itself. Jared Pike, the head of the software team, recognized exactly what Ethan was doing and warned him that Preston would call it unauthorized interference, no matter how it was framed. Ethan answered that he was willing to lose his badge, but not willing to let 22 crews take off without a single layer of protection standing between them and disaster. The next morning, Vanessa stood before a room of investors, while Preston assured everyone that the entire fleet had passed inspection, with no safety concerns whatsoever. Ethan walked into that meeting uninvited, placed a printed report in front of Vanessa, and asked her to ground all 22 aircraft for 48 hours. Furious at the interruption of the most important meeting of her career, Vanessa demanded an explanation, and Preston immediately accused Ethan of exaggerating a technical flaw out of resentment for being passed over for promotion. Ethan did not defend himself. Instead, he laid out the exact failure sequence in plain terms, describing how a faulty temperature sensor sent bad data, how the power distribution unit would restart itself, and how the backup battery could become locked out of the system, entirely leaving pilots with no electronic control at all. When Vanessa asked whether any of this had actually happened yet, Ethan was forced to admit that no aircraft had experienced a complete failure so far. Preston seized on the admission at once, calling the entire warning an unproven hypothetical dressed up as a crisis. Vanessa ordered Ethan out of the room, and as he turned to leave, he told her that by the time she had the proof she wanted, the planes in question would no longer be sitting safely on the ground. Behind closed doors that same afternoon, Preston handed Vanessa a fabricated report accusing Ethan of installing unauthorized code across the entire fleet, framing a safety measure as sabotage. Preston spent the following hours convincing Vanessa that Ethan had become a genuine threat to the merger, showing her selectively edited logs designed to make a protective override look like an illegal intrusion into company systems. Trusting her vice president, rather than verifying the raw data herself, Vanessa summoned Ethan to the engineering floor, just as nearly 100 employees gathered to watch the merger announcement live-streamed from the executive stage. In front of that crowd, she demanded to know why he had altered the configuration of 22 aircraft without authorization from anyone above him. Ethan explained again that he had sent 13 warnings that received no meaningful response, and that his failsafe was designed to activate only after a primary failure had already begun, meaning it could never be the cause of danger, only a response to it. Preston interrupted repeatedly, accusing Ethan of manufacturing a hero complex of secretly wanting a crisis so he could later claim credit for solving it. Vanessa offered him a way out: apologize, publicly delete the protocol, sign a statement admitting fault, and she would allow him to keep working in a lesser role. Ethan refused to strip away the one safeguard standing between 22 aircraft and a shared failure while they were actively preparing for departure. He told her that if she wanted to fire him, that was within her power, but it was not within her power to demand that he place quarterly profits above human lives. The words landed as a public challenge in front of everyone she had gathered to celebrate her biggest achievement. And Vanessa, humiliated and cornered, fired him on the spot for insubordination, procedural violations, and endangering company assets. Security removed his badge immediately, and not a single engineer in that room stepped forward to defend him, though Mara lowered her eyes in shame, and Jared clenched his fists without moving. Preston stood near the back of the crowd with his arms folded, satisfied that the one obstacle standing between him and a flawless merger announcement had finally been removed in front of witnesses who would remember the humiliation far longer than they would remember any warning he had buried. A few younger engineers whispered to each other that Ethan had simply gone too far this time, repeating a version of events Preston had spent weeks quietly shaping in private conversations, designed to isolate him long before that morning ever arrived. Before leaving his desk, Ethan did not delete his files or take anything with him. He simply left behind a black notebook, filled with frequencies, override codes, and handwritten instructions for manually triggering his fail-safe protocol, should anyone ever need it. Looking back at the colleagues who had said nothing, he told them that when the screens eventually turned red, they should not waste time searching for someone to blame, and should instead bring the people up their home first. Vanessa heard him say it, but dismissed it as nothing more than the bitter parting words of a man who had just lost his job. As Ethan walked out of the building, all 22 Aerolynx 90 aircraft began taking off one after another across the country, while Vanessa climbed onto the stage to announce the merger of a lifetime, and Preston stood confidently in the wings, certain that every trace of evidence against him had already been erased. 17 minutes later, inside the Flight Operations Center, the first aircraft transmitted a loss of primary power. 3 seconds after that, a second aircraft reported the identical failure. By the time the sixth alarm sounded, everyone in that room understood this was no longer an isolated malfunction, and within moments, all 22 aircraft icons on the master display turned from green to red at once. Gavin Rowe, the director of flight operations, canceled the announcement immediately and called Vanessa down to the control center, where the enormous screen showed 22 aircraft scattered across different regions of the country, every single one flagged for the same power desynchronization fault. Several were flying directly through a winter storm system, while others were only minutes from landing at some of the busiest airports in the nation, with thousands of passengers and crew members now suspended somewhere between the crisis on the ground and whatever was happening in the sky above them. Preston insisted this was a cyber attack orchestrated by Ethan out of revenge, and demanded that security contact the police immediately, hoping to redirect blame before anyone could look too closely at his own decisions. For the first time, Mara pushed back openly, pointing out that Ethan's code could not possibly have caused the failures, since his failsafe was designed only to engage after the primary systems had already destabilized on their own. The first aircraft lost cabin control and communication for 7 agonizing seconds, and everyone in the room braced to watch it vanish from radar entirely. Then, unexpectedly, backup power returned. The aircraft automatically isolated its failing controller and shifted itself into a limited flight mode, and a line of text appeared quietly in the system log, confirming that the failsafe had activated and the cascading failure had been interrupted. One by one, the other aircraft began triggering the exact same protocol. They remained in danger, but they no longer fell silent from the sky. Gavin reviewed the underlying code and realized Ethan had built a rescue system capable of holding each aircraft stable for roughly 70 minutes, after which the backup power converters risked overheating, entirely leaving a hard deadline hanging over every decision that followed. When Vanessa asked who had approved this protocol, no one answered. Preston continued insisting that Ethan had engineered the failure himself in order to appear as its solution, but Gavin quickly pointed out that the failure had originated from the very software update Preston himself had approved weeks earlier. Pilots across the fleet were now requesting guidance, each aircraft in a slightly different state of crisis, some capable of returning to their departure airport, others requiring an immediate emergency landing, and at least one lacking sufficient power to fully deploy its flaps. Mara opened the notebook Ethan had left behind, though many of its pages were written in a private shorthand only he could reliably interpret under pressure. Vanessa gave the order to call him only to learn that his company phone had been deactivated the instant he was terminated, and that Preston had personally ordered every one of his accounts and access credentials revoked before the ink on the decision had even dried. Gavin explained that they could likely bring 21 aircraft home safely, using the notebook alone. But the 22nd was behaving differently from the rest, and if anyone guessed wrong on a single step, the failsafe could shut down all remaining backup power entirely. Staring at the wall of red icons, Vanessa understood for the first time that Ethan had not caused this crisis at all. He was the only reason it had not already become an irreversible tragedy. Turning to face the entire engineering floor, she asked the question that would define the rest of that day: who had saved all 22 planes? For a long moment, the room was completely silent, filled only with the low hum of monitors and the distant static of pilots, waiting for instructions that no one yet knew how to give. Every person in that room understood exactly what the question meant, and exactly what answering it honestly would cost them, since admitting the truth also meant admitting they had watched a man be destroyed for being right, and had done nothing to stop it. Then Mara was the first to raise her hand and point toward Ethan's empty desk. Jared did the same a heartbeat later. One after another, every engineer, every software specialist, every inspector and maintenance lead in that room turned to face the same direction, not toward Preston, not toward the automated systems, and not toward the executives who had built their careers on confident announcements. They pointed toward the chair belonging to the man Vanessa had fired and humiliated less than an hour earlier. Mara finally admitted in front of everyone that Ethan had identified the flaw 6 weeks earlier, built a working model to prove it, filed 13 separate warnings, and requested that the fleet be grounded, and that everyone in that room had known he was right long before that morning, yet none of them had been brave enough to stand against Preston publicly. When Vanessa demanded to know why she had never once seen those reports herself, Jared pulled up the server logs and showed her that every email Ethan had sent had been quietly redirected using administrative privileges that only Preston controlled. Preston called it standard procedure and claimed the system was simply overloaded when Vanessa asked him to display the original unedited files. In the middle of that argument, one aircraft lost control of its flaps entirely, and its captain reported only 46 minutes remaining before the backup power supply would be exhausted completely. Vanessa ordered her staff to find Ethan by any means necessary, and when security checked the exterior cameras, they discovered he had not gone home at all. Instead, he had driven to an old hangar on the outskirts of the city, where he had once tested backup electrical systems on his own time, long before anyone else believed the danger was real. Vanessa intended to send someone else to retrieve him, but Gavin stopped her, warning that Ethan would trust no one from the company after everything he had endured that morning. She understood almost instantly that she would have to go herself. Before leaving the control room, she formally transferred temporary command to Gavin and ordered that not a single file be deleted while she was gone. A small but telling sign that her suspicion of Preston had already begun to take root. At the hangar, Ethan had been listening to aviation radio chatter since the moment he left the building, using outdated equipment to track the status of all 22 aircraft on his own. Unwilling to simply walk away from the people still in the air, even after everything, Vanessa arrived, still dressed for the merger announcement, without lawyers, without handlers, and without a script prepared for what she was about to say. She told him plainly that the company needed him. Ethan answered that the company had needed him 6 weeks earlier, back when his warning was simply inconvenient for a rising stock price. She asked him to come back and promised to sort everything out once the planes were on the ground. But Ethan refused to accept a vague promise from someone who had proven only hours before exactly how quickly she could turn on him under pressure. Instead, he laid out 3 conditions she had to record on the spot that she was granting him full technical command. Every scrap of data had to be preserved without exception, and Preston was never to be allowed near the systems again. Vanessa agreed immediately and without hesitation. Ethan asked her quietly whether she actually trusted him or was simply desperate enough to say anything. She answered honestly that she did not yet know who she could trust, but that 22 aircraft were still in the sky only because of a system he had built. Ethan closed the old radio, picked up his tool bag, and followed her back toward the building that had discarded him only hours earlier. Gavin called to report that the 22nd aircraft had just lost another power converter entirely, leaving it with roughly 28 minutes before its situation became irreversible. When Ethan walked back through the doors of the company that had fired him, the hallway fell into silence around him, every employee remembering exactly how they had watched him be escorted out less than 2 hours before. Some of them looked away, entirely unable to meet his eyes, after standing by in silence, while others simply stepped aside to let him pass, as though the corridor itself understood that something fundamental had shifted since that morning. Now the survival of thousands of people rested in the hands of that same man. Security instinctively reached for a badge that no longer existed, but Vanessa personally unlocked the door to the control room and announced in front of everyone present that Ethan held full technical authority until every remaining aircraft had landed safely. He wasted no time on vindication or speeches. Within minutes, he had divided the engineering staff into 4 teams, each assigned to a different category of failure spreading across the fleet. He instructed pilots to shut down non-essential systems, reduce battery load, adjust altitude where possible, and avoid performing simultaneous actions that might trigger another restart of the power distribution unit. Gavin took charge of communication with the airports below, Mara worked through the notebook's remaining pages, and Jared began recovering data from the backup servers as fast as the system would allow. One by one, aircraft began altering course toward the nearest available airport, and Preston, still present in the room, tried to intervene, warning that mass emergency landings would cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars. It could not easily recover. Ethan ordered him removed from the room without a second thought, and Vanessa, after a brief hesitation that revealed just how deeply Preston's influence still ran through her, finally gave the order to have him escorted out. Moments later, Mara uncovered a record showing that Preston had disabled a mandatory safety test outright and altered the results of 6 separate simulations to hide repeated instances of the very power failure now unfolding in real time. Furious Vanessa ordered his access credentials revoked completely. Preston lashed out, accusing her of handing the entire company over to a disgruntled former employee, warning that if the merger collapsed because of this, the board would remove her from her position without hesitation. Vanessa looked at the wall of red icons and told him plainly that if a single aircraft went down, she would not deserve to remain chief executive of anything. As he was being let out, Preston secretly used his phone to issue a remote command to delete critical system files, and although Jared managed to stop most of it, a portion of the original test logs was lost forever, saved only because Mara had quietly kept her own backup copy, exactly as Ethan had once asked her to. The first aircraft began its descent, while the confrontation was still unfolding, and because its flap system was only partially functional, its landing speed was significantly higher than normal. Ethan guided its pilot through a precise 9-second power cycle, designed to restore partial control at the critical final moment before touchdown. The aircraft hit the runway hard, skidded for what felt like an eternity, and finally came to a stop safely, and though the room wanted to celebrate immediately, Ethan silenced them with a reminder that 21 aircraft were still in the air and still depending on every decision made in that room. One by one, the second, third, and fourth aircraft landed safely behind it, and Vanessa, standing quietly behind the man she had once called insubordinate, began to understand that he had never been fighting against authority at all. He had only ever been fighting against decisions that put people in danger. By the time the 18th aircraft touched down, the backup power on the final remaining flight suddenly dropped to a dangerous level. Its captain was Claire Maddox, and she reported that the power converter had locked completely, meaning the failsafe could not restore itself a second time. Reviewing the data in front of him, Ethan said quietly that this particular aircraft could not be brought down using any procedure written in any manual that existed. It had received a different version of the update than the other 21-1. Preston had secretly used as a private test platform to prove the software was safe, and the deeper alteration meant the failsafe could no longer fully isolate the failing power distribution unit the way it had for every other aircraft that day. Ethan asked Claire to hold altitude and fly a wide fuel-conserving pattern while he searched for a solution, but she reported worsening weather ahead and fuel reserves that would not allow for much more delay, her voice calm over the radio, even as the numbers on her own display continued falling, with every passing minute. While he worked, federal safety investigator Dana Holloway arrived at the control center with her team, demanding the flight logs and an explanation for why a recently terminated engineer was now directing a national crisis. Vanessa did not hide from the question. She admitted without hesitation that she herself had signed the order to fire Ethan without ever verifying the original data behind it. Dana revealed that federal investigators had already received a complete evidence package automatically transmitted the moment all 22 aircraft first reported failure, sent by Ethan Mercer himself, who had quietly built a system to preserve the truth in case anyone ever tried to erase it. Preston was brought back in for questioning and immediately accused Ethan of planting what he called a software bomb designed to sabotage the merger from within. When Dana asked Ethan to prove that his failsafe had not caused the failures, he displayed the precise timeline the update. Preston approved triggered the first power loss at 10:17 and 8 seconds, while the failsafe did not activate until 3 full seconds later, a gap that proved beyond doubt that his system had responded to the crisis rather than created it. Mara handed over copies of the falsified test results, and Jared recovered an email in which Preston had explicitly instructed the team to soften the language of their reports so the merger would not be delayed. Dana ordered Preston detained immediately to prevent any further interference. But Ethan refused to let the investigation distract from the fact that one aircraft was still losing power by the minute. He identified an untested emergency option, cutting all power to the flight computer for exactly 14 seconds, then restarting it, using current drawn from the auxiliary engine, a maneuver that would leave the pilot with almost no electronic assistance for that entire window. Gavin objected immediately, warning that the procedure could turn the aircraft into an uncontrollable piece of metal, with no warning if it failed. Ethan explained that it was the only remaining path to unlocking the frozen power converter, but he refused to give the order without speaking directly to Claire and telling her exactly what she would be risking. He told her honestly that the odds of success were roughly 60% and that without attempting it, the system would fail completely before she ever reached the runway. Claire asked him whether he trusted the machine he had built, and Ethan answered that he did not trust the machine at all. He trusted that she could fly the aircraft the moment the machine stopped helping her. There was a brief pause on the radio, just long enough for Ethan to wonder if she had changed her mind before her voice returned steady, and certain, telling him she was ready whenever he was. Claire agreed, and Ethan began counting down the seconds until she cut the power entirely. The moment Claire shut down the power management system, the flight vanished from the main tracking display, leaving only a faint primary radar signal with no altitude data and no confirmation of engine status. Ethan counted silently through each passing second, while the entire room held its breath around him. At the 8-second mark, no backup signal appeared. By the 11th second, Gavin quietly said the maneuver had likely failed. Then, exactly at the 14th second, Claire restarted the auxiliary engine, and a weak signal returned, though the power converter itself still refused to unlock. Ethan realized the update had added an extra security cycle that required a manual mechanical release, and he guided Claire through a physical override switch located behind her seat, one that had to be reached and pulled by her first officer while she fought to keep the aircraft level. Power partially returned, giving them enough control to fly, but only enough energy remaining for a single landing gear deployment and one flap adjustment. The nearest airport was reporting strong crosswinds, and with fuel running critically low, there was no time to divert anywhere else. Ethan designed a landing sequence that had never been attempted before. Claire would approach at higher speed than normal, hold the landing gear in position until the last possible moment, and reserve all remaining power for a 23-second flap deployment right before touchdown. When Vanessa asked if he was certain this would work, Ethan told her that no one could ever be certain, only that this plan was built on data rather than hope. 2 more aircraft landed safely during this exchange, bringing the total to 21, and brief applause rippled through the room before Gavin silenced it with a single raised hand, reminding everyone that the hardest landing of the day was still ahead of them. Every remaining eye in the room turned toward the final flight, still fighting its way home. As Claire began, her approach, crosswinds pushed the aircraft off the center line, and warning systems flickered on and off unpredictably. Ethan told her to ignore the false alerts entirely and focus only on the 3 readings he knew were still reliable. With the aircraft only a few hundred feet above the ground, the power converter began overheating again, leaving less than a minute before it would shut down permanently. Claire deployed the landing gear, but one side locked slower than the other, and Ethan instructed her to hold the aircraft in a slight bank to reduce stress on the sides still catching up. Vanessa stood beside Ethan without saying a word, no longer trying to control the outcome, finally placing her complete trust in the man she had fired that same morning. The aircraft touched down hard on one side, first bounced, then struck the runway a second time as one engine shut down entirely, sending it briefly off the center line before Claire wrestled it back under control. It finally rolled to a stop only a short distance from the end of the runway. Inside the control room, all 22 aircraft icons turned from red to green, one after another, and for several seconds, no one spoke at all. Then the entire room broke into relief. Vanessa turned toward Ethan, but he did not celebrate. He simply asked Gavin to confirm that every passenger and crew member had exited safely. Once that confirmation came through, Ethan sat down for the first time since returning to the building. Vanessa looked at the empty chair every engineer in that room had pointed toward hours earlier, and finally understood that the person who had saved the company was not the person she had trusted the most. He was the person she had refused to listen to. In the days that followed, the crisis gave way to a formal investigation. Dana sealed Preston's servers, communications, and devices, and early findings showed he had known about the software flaw for at least 2 months before it nearly cost lives. He had delayed every fix because further testing threatened to postpone a deal worth $4.6 billion, and he stood to receive a substantial bonus if the agreement closed on schedule. The most damning piece of evidence was a recording in which Preston instructed the outside vendor to continue releasing the update, despite simulation results warning of exactly the kind of simultaneous power failure that had nearly grounded the entire fleet in the worst possible way. Investigators also uncovered a pattern stretching back nearly 2 years, showing that Preston had quietly rewritten risk classifications on at least 7 earlier occasions, whenever a warning threatened to slow a deadline he cared about meeting. The near disaster with the Aerolynx fleet was not an isolated lapse in judgment, but the continuation of a habit no one inside the company had ever been willing to challenge until Ethan refused to stay silent. Preston attempted to shift blame onto Vanessa, insisting that her constant pressure to finalize the merger had left him no choice. Vanessa did not deny her role in creating that pressure. She admitted publicly that she had built a culture where good news was rewarded and warnings were treated as obstacles rather than gifts. When the board of directors urged her to place the entire blame on Preston in order to protect the stock price, she refused outright. In front of reporters, Vanessa stated plainly that she alone had signed the order to fire. Ethan confirmed that he had warned the company 13 separate times and acknowledged that his protocol alone had saved all 22 aircraft. She also announced an immediate grounding of the entire fleet pending an independent safety review, a decision that would cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars, but one she refused to revert, even as several major shareholders privately urged her to reconsider. Before the market opened the following morning, Preston was formally investigated for falsifying safety records, obstructing a federal inquiry, and endangering commercial aviation operations. Mara and Jared were protected under whistleblower provisions and openly admitted in front of the engineering staff that their own silence had allowed Preston to continue hiding the truth for far longer than it should have taken to surface, a confession that visibly unsettled colleagues who realized they had made the same quiet calculation themselves at some point over the past several years. Ethan was invited before the board, where several members offered to reinstate him with back pay and a promotion to vice president of engineering. He turned down the initial offer, entirely explaining that the problem was never his title. If the company simply replaced one flawed leader with another while leaving the underlying system untouched, the same disaster would eventually happen again in some other form. Instead, Ethan proposed 5 conditions of his own: the creation of an independent safety board with real authority, formal protection for anyone who raised a safety concern, a permanent ban on executives altering technical risk classifications themselves, a requirement that every serious failure be reported directly to both the chief executive and federal regulators without delay, and an end to financial bonuses tied to targets that could only be met by cutting corners on safety. Some board members resisted, arguing the conditions would strip away too much of their control, and one longtime director insisted that no engineer, however capable, should be allowed to dictate terms to the people who technically owned the company. Ethan replied that ownership of a company did not extend to ownership of the truth, and that the moment leadership believed otherwise was the exact moment 22 aircraft had nearly fallen out of the sky. Vanessa announced she would resign immediately if the board refused to adopt every single one of them, a decision that had nothing to do with winning back Ethan's approval and everything to do with placing responsibility above her own position for the first time in her career. Facing her resignation, the board reluctantly approved all 5 conditions in full. Afterward, Vanessa met privately with Ethan on the engineering floor and apologized for humiliating him in front of the very people he had spent weeks trying to protect. Ethan told her that an apology could not undo what had already happened, but the way she chose to run the company from that day forward could determine whether it ever happened again to someone else. 3 months later, all 22 Aerolynx 90 aircraft returned to service following a completely rebuilt inspection program. The original software flaw was fixed at its root, and Ethan's failsafe became the new industry standard emergency protocol shared openly with other airlines, instead of kept as a private advantage. Ethan accepted a newly created role as Director of Safety Architecture, though his contract specifically stated that no chief executive or board member would ever again have the authority to override a serious safety warning without an independent review taking place first. He declined the polished corner office prepared for him, and instead asked for a desk placed in the middle of the engineering floor, where any engineer could bring him raw data directly without a single layer of bureaucracy standing in the way. Mara was promoted to lead an independent verification team, and Jared built an archival system specifically designed so that no single individual could ever again quietly alter or erase a safety report on their own. Vanessa remained chief executive after a formal board vote, though her authority was now subject to far greater oversight than before, a change she accepted without complaint, telling the board privately that she would rather lead a company that questioned her than one that simply agreed with everything she said. During a company-wide meeting, she stood in the exact spot where she had once fired Ethan in front of nearly 100 witnesses. Rather than staging an elaborate celebration, she displayed all 13 of his original reports on the screen behind her, including the date each one was sent, who received it, and precisely how each one had been dismissed or buried along the way. Vanessa told the room that the company's greatest failure had never been a single flawed line of code. It was a system that had allowed one honest employee to be treated as a problem simply for telling an inconvenient truth. She turned to the engineers gathered before her and asked what they would do the next time someone warned them they were making a dangerous mistake. Mara answered that they would check the evidence. Jared said they would refuse to stay silent. Gavin added that they would not wait until the screens turned red to act. Vanessa then invited Ethan to speak, and rather than describing how he had saved 22 aircraft, he thanked the pilots, the operations staff, and the engineers who had worked alongside him through the worst hours of that crisis, closing simply by saying that no one saves 22 planes alone, but sometimes everyone is saved because one person refuses to stay quiet. The story closed on a quiet evening with Ethan walking through the empty engineering floor and stopping at the desk that had once sat abandoned for hours while the crisis unfolded around it. On the wall above him hung a live map tracking all 22 aircraft, each one a small green light moving safely across the night sky. Vanessa approached and placed his old employee badge on the desk in front of him. The word "terminated" replaced, now with a new title reading Independent Safety Authority. Ethan did not reach for it right away. He stood there for a moment, remembering the 13 reports that had once vanished into silence, the empty chair that colleagues had pointed toward when they finally found their courage, and the 28 minutes that had once separated an ordinary evening from a national tragedy. None of that history disappeared simply because the company had rebuilt itself around better rules. It remained the reason those rules now existed at all. He looked at the map instead and asked whether the newest failure report from the testing division had been reviewed yet. Vanessa handed him the file and told him that this time she had read it first. Ethan opened it to the first page, and together they walked back toward the review room, the lights of 22 aircraft, still moving steadily overhead, each one a small reminder of how close silence had once come to costing everything, and how much closer the truth had brought them since. An organization does not fail because someone delivers a warning that is hard to hear. It fails when the people holding power choose to punish the messenger in order to protect their reputation, their profits, and their pride.